Who took Spanish in high school? Yeah, remember oral exams? Yeah? Anybody? Raise your hands. Hey! Yeah, they fucking suck. I remember my oral exams, my freshman year of high school terrified me. I spent all night memorizing how to conjugate all the verbs, like the irregular ones and the subjunctive and the conjugate, everything, because I'd seen people the day before stumble on that, the verb conjugation, which they'd had to do for like 45 minutes. So I showed up that day in Spanish class, and Senor Codavilla, who was an old school Castilian Spanish man, he was like in his 50s, and he came in wearing brown corduroys and a white shirt, and he had a fedora and glasses. He stalked in and threw his briefcase down, threw his fedora on the floor, looked me straight in the eyes, and said, "Miguel, ¿estás listo?" "Yeah, no, I'm ready, I'm ready." "Pues, ¿cuál es tu problema?" "What's your problem?" And I looked at him and I went, no tengo problemas, I'm good, I'm all good. And he said, "No, what's your problem?" "Well, my problem is you're not letting me conjugate verbs. I stayed up all night long, I really wanted to conjugate some verbs, and he wouldn't let me." And he said, "No, ¿cuál es tu problema?" And I tried to explain, and I tried at first in English because I was shocked, but he wouldn't let me. He said, "No, solamente en español." So for the next hour, I had to defend my life to Senor Codavilla. I told him that maybe I did have problems. Maybe I spent a little bit too much time studying. Maybe I didn't get out enough. Maybe I lived in a neighborhood where I got my ass kicked a little bit. And he's like, no es problemas. Tu problema es que no tienes problemas. Who gets that deep in their Spanish oral exam? And I was like, what are you talking about? And I could tell that the entire class was really tense, and by the end of it, I was drenched in sweat. And the bell finally rang, and Senor Codavilla said, "It's over." And I saw him write an A on a piece of paper, but he wasn't smiling. He looked at me, and there was this sense of disappointment in the room. And I didn't understand why. I mean, I'd gotten an A. What the hell else are you supposed to want in high school? And I didn't get it. So, okay, let's skip 20 years. I now have a job. And ostensibly, right on paper, it's an amazing job. Check this out. I help people solve problems. I'm a consultant for non-profit organizations. I'm a fucking samurai with a laptop over my back, and I travel the length and breadth of California dispensing razor-sharp wisdom and leaving a trail of empowered organizations in my wake. That is bullshit. Here's what I really do. I sit in a beige-colored room that gets indirect sunlight for 8 to 10 hours a day, entering numbers into a spreadsheet. The spreadsheet tells me when I've entered the numbers incorrectly by giving me a big red flag. I then spend the next 10 hours trying to figure out what those flags mean. And then I call the nonprofit organizations and I say things like, "Your revenue and expense ratio is off. You're unable to generate constant surpluses, and that has created a negative liquidity situation." And I listen as their souls crush, and it is excruciating. So at the end of a day like that, I am hollowed out. I feel like a shell of a human being. My head is hung low, my shoulders are rounded, and I walk back to my car, totally oblivious, wrapped in my own sense of existential despair. And that's where I was 2 weeks ago. I was just walking through the Los Angeles dusk when I heard a question from over to my right. "Hey man, what did you accomplish today?" And normally I would ignore voices coming from my right slightly down, because those are homeless people and they're going to ask me for money. But the question was so apt and so perfectly timed that I answered probably more honestly than I'd answered any question. I looked at the guy and I went, "Abso-fucking-lutely nothing, man." And he looked at me and his eyes were sort of watery but focused, and he was rubbing a calloused foot with his hand, and he had an open container of Schlitz malt liquor in a brown paper bag next to him. And he went, man, I can tell. "You know what? You gotta make a list." I was like, "What?" "No, just make a list. Make a list. Doesn't matter. It could be folding laundry, make whatever. And then you cross things off the list, and it's gonna make you feel good. And I'm a crack addict. And I drink too much. I know today, you know what was on my list? Ask someone what they accomplished. Got that?" I was taken with this man. His name was Keith Allen Green. We talked for like an hour. And as I've been walking, like before I met Keith Allen Green, I've been hearing Senor Codavilla's voice in my head. "¿Cuál es tu problema? If you hate your job, just quit." And I was like, I can't quit. I'll become homeless. Because in my mind, this is what I believe. There's no true Hollywood story just sent into drugs and alcohol. I quit my job, I immediately, like a switch, I become homeless. And I was talking to a homeless man, and it occurred to me, that he was like this external manifestation of my worst nightmare for myself. And as he talked more, I realized we had a lot in common. He said he liked people. I liked people. He said that he liked making connections. I like making connections. He said that he had an ego problem. I sure as hell have an ego problem. And it occurred to me that we were almost exactly the same. He was black, and there were times in my life when I thought I was black, which is a different story, but I'm not. And he likes Schlitz malt liquor, and that shit makes me puke. But at the end of the day, this guy was smart, he was savvy, he knew what was what. The only difference between him and me was that when he fell off the wagon, he had been 90 days sober, he told me. But that weekend, he decided, you know what? I'm gonna test myself, I'm gonna go back to Skid Row. And he did. And 3 days later, he found himself talking to me, still drunk off his ass and probably high on crack. When he falls off the wagon, that's what happens to him. When I fall off the wagon, I eat too many brownies. And that hurts my tummy a little bit. And it occurred to me as I was talking to him, and he was saying, you know what, this is just a phase for me. I know that I'm going to get out of this. I've gotten out of it before. That if this was my nightmare, that if this is the worst thing that could happen to me, if I quit my job and left my sense of existential despair behind or whatever, then that would be okay because he still had hope, right? And we left it with like a little fist bump. I went, that's Keith Allen Green, and he said, I'll see you around, Michael Kass. I realized he could probably find me on the internet now. But I walked back up the stairs, and my sense, all of those tiny troubles there's the theme, by the way, that I'd been wrapped up in kind of disappeared. And I wished that I could go back to Senor Cadavilla's 9th grade Spanish class, and he would say, Miguel, ¿cuál es tu problema? And I'd say, Senor Cadavilla, my problem is that I got really distracted by these stupid, tiny problems, and I got wrapped up in this shit, and I forgot about the big questions. That maybe it's time for me to get into a little bit of trouble. That maybe it's time for me to answer questions like, I don't know, who am I? What am I doing here? Little things like that. That if the worst thing that happens is I end up homeless like Keith Allen Green, at least I'll be able to find an office drone who needs a little bit of help and help him out. And Senor Cadavilla, in my imagination, he looked at me, and his eyes were twinkling, and he failed me because I don't speak Spanish anymore, so I would say all that in English. But that sense of disappointment wouldn't be there, and he'd smile because he'd realize that after 20 years, I finally learned something. Thank you.